Hello, I'm speaking to you from the south of France, where I am now in my library, and I wanted to introduce you to the situation in which Kimchungup found himself arriving in Paris, and during his stay of a little more than 3 years in the studio of Le Corbusier. So let me go back to my presentation and introduce you to what I consider as the transformative period in the work of Le Corbusier after the war. I call it a reinvention in which Kim has been very significantly involved, not as a, I would say, a major protagonist, but as a major companion and instrument in the making of Le Corbusier's architecture, an experience which will change him forever and will determine his future life and work upon his return to Korea in 1955. Le Corbusier, after 1945, is an acknowledged master. He has redefined his architecture and expanded his perception of the arts, and including his own practice of the arts. We see him in his studio, on top of his apartment in the west of Paris, trying to defining himself as an artist on par with Picasso, Matisse, and the main figures of the School of Paris. In this photograph, we see him wrestling with the materials of his artwork and wandering through the different media he used during that period. So it is well known that Le Corbusier spent the morning in his studio painting or writing, and the afternoon in the office, where he had put together a crowd of remarkable young people from all over the world. In this former gallery, this former corridor of a Catholic monastery on Paris' left bank, he gathered remarkable people. We see here on the left Yannis Xenakis, Greek mathematician and engineer, who will go on to be a remarkable inventor of contemporary music. We see here Balkrishna Doshi, a young Indian architect who will be a major force in the shaping of new architecture in India after his return to Ahmedabad. Jacques Michel, who worked on the Jaul houses here, and of course, under the red arrow, Kim, who spent 3 years and 2 months in Le Corbusier studio, and who made, according to the remarkable research made by Namtek Soon, he drafted 326 drawings. So he had a significant contribution in the graphic output of the studio, and not only in the graphics, but in the development, what is called in French mise au point, in the fine-tuning of Le Corbusier's projects. So Le Corbusier's studio, and this is what we see here in the background, was a long corridor in which Le Corbusier was working underneath his large painting, which represents the new directions in his artwork after 1945. These new directions are put under the sign of what Le Corbusier calls the synthesis of the arts, a preoccupation which is widespread among the architects and artists of this generation, the idea that architecture should contribute to the shaping of unified works of art. But for Le Corbusier, the synthesis had another meaning. The meaning was that he had the key himself, personally, individually, in his own work to the synthesis by the variety of media he used. And when Kim joined the studio on Rue de Sèvres in 1952, Le Corbusier was busy working on a new series of paintings. You see here the theme of the bull, which emerged then in his painting. We see the nose, we recognize the nose of the bull, sometimes the horns. This is one of the new figurative themes on which he worked in series, producing hundreds of paintings. At the same time, Le Corbusier had engaged into a new practice, which he had not explored before the Second World War. This was the practice of sculpture. He was not himself a sculptor, but used the hands of Joseph Savina, a Breton woodworker, Breton joiner, to implement sculptures he had drawn in 2 dimensions on paper. The production of sculptures was less important altogether than the production of paintings. Le Corbusier made throughout his life probably 400 paintings and only 80 sculptures, but in a shorter span of time. And we see here some of them in an exhibition I had curated some 10 years ago in Moscow. We see the variety of these sculptures and the role color played, color which was often applied by Le Corbusier himself after Savina had made the wooden object. Le Corbusier also engaged with other media during that period. Here we see, for instance, the enameled steel door of the Assembly in Chandigarh, a late work in which many themes of his graphic reflections of the 50s are assembled. Many themes of his poem of a right angle, for instance. Le Corbusier painted the enameled steel, which were then baked by a producer in France. And finally, here we'll meet again a little later, the contribution of Kim. Le Corbusier also engaged with tapestry and developed his own theory about tapestry. Tapestry not meant in most cases for palatial interiors, for monumental interiors, but rather for domestic interiors. He called the tapestry, the French term he used was mural nomade or mural nomad, i.e. a work of art which could be rolled and could be moved from one dwelling to the next by the inhabitants. So he had the idea that tapestry would be a way of introducing warmth and also poetic intensity into dry contemporary interiors. His tapestries developed many themes coming from his painting, new themes which addressed also the work of contemporary painters such as Henri Matisse during that period. Finally, Le Corbusier tried to hold all these elements of the synthesis of the arts together. One way was his own attempt at articulating the different visual and iconic registers of his work. And this is, for instance, what he did with a portfolio of lithographs, another medium, by the way, a portfolio of lithograph, which was printed in 1955, a poem of a right angle in which his own poetic writing was combined with the deployment of many shapes which belong to his architectural work or to his painting work. Another tool and to achieve a synthesis of the arts, which was proper to Le Corbusier, which was in a way his secret for bringing a unity in all the realms of his work, was proportion. Le Corbusier had been interested in proportion ever since his early writings, and in particular his first manifesto of 1923, the Towards an Architecture, which had a worldwide success in the 1920s. During the war and immediately after the war, he tried to develop his own scheme of harmonic proportions based on the golden section, connected, articulated with a statistical stature of humans. And this led him to create literally a new system of measurements, which could be used, for instance, with this modular measuring tape. In 1950, he published the first volume discussing all the uses of the modular and consistently used the system in his drawings, also asking all the members of the studio, all the young craftspeople in the studio to use it in their projects. And this included, of course, Kim. Now, what were the domains of Le Corbusier's post-war invention, post-war thinking? The first one was, of course, the architecture of residential space, domestic space. Le Corbusier had built before the war a series of remarkable villas, which I don't need to mention to you today for the sake of time, such as Villa Stein, Villa Savoie. He had also engaged a reflection on collective housing, on large housing schemes, which he started to develop in the context of French reconstruction after the war. As you know, France had been heavily bombed by the Germans and later by the Allies. Some cities were completely ruined. This was the case of the small city of Saint-Dié in the east of France, for which Le Corbusier designed this very radical scheme in which the complete city fabric was replaced by a system of large slabs, which he called unités d'habitation in residential units, which were collective buildings, with a very long genesis in his work, coming back to his villa apartments of the 1920s and developed through a number of theoretical projects. This project was very bold, probably too bold, and was shut down by the local population and the local organization. So this very ambitious scheme came to nothing, and Le Corbusier had no opportunity to build an entire city or even a full neighborhood during the reconstruction. He managed, however, to get the possibility of implementing the idea of the unité d'habitation in Marseille with this enormous housing block featuring 336 dwelling units and collective services. Here we see in a photograph by the British photographer Richard Pear, and we'll see more of these. I have published with Pear a very large book on Le Corbusier's built work, and these pictures are featured in the book. So with Richard, we went to see systematically, again, in my case, most of Le Corbusier's projects to get these striking images of the unité d'habitation, which has a huge blocks, floats above the ground, articulates a typology of double height apartments, which has a long story in Le Corbusier's work as it goes back to his houses of the 1920s. In short, the unité d'habitation is a synthesis of Le Corbusier's pre-war work, but redefined, reassembled, and which uses the colors, as you see here, of these post-war paintings and not those of the purist buildings. Here we have, in this other photo by Pear, I think a striking view of the connection the Unité had with Le Corbusier's, or rather Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, it's his initial official name, the connection the Unité had with Le Corbusier's early impressions of the Mediterranean. It is possible, and he did it himself, to connect the Unité with his perception of the Acropolis of Athens during his trip of 1911. And here we see how the Unité, as a sort of abstract block connected with the sea and the islands, can be seen as an implementation of Le Corbusier's ideas of the Acropolis. And this is also, I must insist on this post-war period was also for him a period in which he reminisced, in which he remembered and reactivated memories of his youth. The Unité was followed by several other buildings. One of them, the second one, was built in Nantes, in the west of France, in the middle of agricultural farms, as you see from my photo on the left. Kim worked on this project, which was a sort of slightly simplified version of the Unité. Le Corbusier also worked for himself. Besides the largest housing structure he had ever designed, he built the smallest one, which was his summer shack, his cabanon, on the French Riviera, where he would put his, he would spend his summers. This cabanon is extremely important in Le Corbusier post-war work as a sort of microcosm. And as you see from this photograph, from the microcosm of the cabanon, you could see the cosmos at large, the large world. This building represents Le Corbusier's solitude, Le Corbusier's loneliness in the post-war years, as in a way he focused really stubbornly on his own work, but at the same time, his ability at observing and looking at the world. Close to the cabanon, in the city of Roquebrune, the cabanon was by the sea. He worked at a series of projects, in fact, 2 different projects. You see here the village of Roquebrune and the lower slope on which he designed this project for a summer village which used vaults, the vaults he had seen during his travel in Spain and Greece. This first project was called Rock. The second project, called Robe, was located very close to the cabanon, was meant to be located very close to the cabanon on the very shore of the Mediterranean. And this is a project for which we know that Kim was active and made drawings. Kim also worked on a project which was almost completed as a design during those years, which also says something about Le Corbusier's work for domestic architecture. The Jaoul houses, built very close to Paris, the 2 houses for the Jaoul family, the father, who was an engineer Le Corbusier knew from the 1930s, and his son, André and Michel. And we see here a completely new approach to domestic architecture, very different from the white villas of the 1930s. These houses have a very expressive materiality using concrete and brick. This raw language in French, raw is brut, was the origin of the term brutalisme, which is in general misunderstood, equated with brutal, with or brutal in French, as it is in fact related to brut, i.e. rough. So this rough architecture in which, here, a house for the elite uses the materiality of the industrial vernacular would be an important theme in the work of Le Corbusier. When we look also inside, I think it's really important to look at the interior space of the Jaoul houses. We also see one new aspect, which is in respect to the Spartan, to the very sparse character of these first houses, a certain notion of comfort. The Jaoul houses were more habitable, were more usable than the early villas. Le Corbusier had learned something. There is a new category in which his work develops during that period, and this is the category of religious architecture, sacred art. Le Corbusier had met Catholic priests who were engaged in the renovation of religious architecture. They were the publishers of a journal called Sacred Art, L'Art Sacré, and they were at the source of 2 very defining commissions. The first one was the commission for a pilgrimage church in eastern France, where for which Le Corbusier made a statement which completely shocked his most sincere and engaged supporters. So I think this is one of the key aspects in Le Corbusier's work at the time of Kim's presence. Le Corbusier breaks with his orthogonal language, still present in a building like the Marseille block, and engages in an architecture which can be related no longer to his paintings, but to his sculpture. And this is the case in Ronchamp. The building has many sources which have been introduced by himself. The roof can be compared to, can be seen as developed out from this crab shell he had found in Long Island while working on the United Nations project. It was built like an airplane wing, which you see on the right. The wall, in particular, the southern wall with its small openings, can be connected with these memories of Algerian architecture from the 1930s, and the towers catching light, which you see here, for instance, here. Which you see here, can be connected with graves he had seen in the island of Ischia near Naples in Italy. So Ronchamp was a sort of integration, crystallization of many, many layers of memories, but articulated in a completely new shape. And this is also true of the church's interior, in which we see how the different categories of lights are used, from natural light, which is framed, for instance, around this little statue of Virgin Mary, slots which allow us to understand the fact that the roof is carried by very few points, a colored light also which filters through the wall, the south wall, for which Le Corbusier has invented a sort of new concept for religious interior, in echo to the stained glass of the medieval churches. Le Corbusier also worked, and I won't be very long about this, also worked at a second project, which is the monastery at La Tourette, which has a very complex genesis and is important. Probably this is also something, one of the themes Kim became familiar with during his tenure at the Rue de Sèvres studio. The monastery at La Tourette was built not from the ground up, but from the sky down. And we see this in the first sketch of Le Corbusier, which he delineates the line of the hills in the distance, and then he finds the horizontal on the roof and brings the building down to the ground. So this sensitivity to a site which is not only a slope, a terrain, but also inscribed in a longer perspective is extremely important in this project. Also significant is the use, and this is something we'll find in the early buildings by Kim, the use of the modular to shape the glazing of the corridors, and also another perspective on a light, which is very different light from the light in Ronchamp, and which is also inscribed in a sort of astronomic reflection, bringing light on the cross on the summer solstice every year. So a building full of intentions, in which also, as we understand it on the left, the sculptural quality of Le Corbusier's work is clearly present. But the great experiment during these years, from 1951 to the death of Le Corbusier, was his work in India, in which Kim was also heavily engaged. Le Corbusier found in India, in Punjab, the opportunity he never had and will never have anywhere else of designing an entire city. As we know, and he did this in relationship with, again, with his own repertory of forms, with the site itself, and also with his perception of Indian popular culture. I think that the transposition of the Indian vernacular is a significant feature of Chandigarh. So we see here the previous situation, which I need to remind, Chandigarh was not a complete creation of Le Corbusier, but a sort of response, a critical response to an earlier plan made by Albert Meyer, an architect from New York, who was extremely engaged in the Garden City movement and had designed before a first plan. Le Corbusier changed the plan. In particular, he redefined the relationship between the city and the political center called the capital. And this is what you see on this model, the sectors of the city and the capital. And on this plan, Le Corbusier did not work directly on the architecture of housing in the sectors. He focused on the capital and made a very important statement there, which was large, which had several sources, which I have discussed in my exhibition at MoMA on the Corbusian landscape some 9 years ago. Here we see one of the sources in his reflection on the sectors was the vernacular architecture, was the architecture of Indian villages in the plain of Chandigarh. And I'm convinced that what I perceive as Kim's perceptiveness of Korean vernacular culture can be referred to this, what Le Corbusier was talking about in his studio. Another source, which is very interesting and completely different, and I don't have enough time to discuss it here, was Le Corbusier's knowledge of the ancient world and the reflections he had developed since his youth on Roman architecture. This is a sketch he made after an engraving of Renaissance Rome, in which you see this autonomous building standing on the ground, and in which he writes, 1915, that this scheme was an ideal view of what a modern city could be. So this modern city, he waited some between 1915 and 51. He waited for 35 years to be in grade of doing. So, and you understand the relationship when looking at the original wooden model of the capital here, which has a series of features, in particular, the relationship of the different levels in the ground, relationship to the gardens of Punjab, but also a relationship to Le Corbusier's own sculptural work. Here, you see the model and the sand cast, which is a sculpture made in sand on the beach of Long Island, in which we find exactly the same kind of configuration as the one we see here on this model. The sand cast here, which is was made for, and together with his friend, the Sardinian sculptor, Constantino Nivola. So there are many sources for the plan of Chandigarh and for each building. So the buildings, this is also a significant feature, are inscribed against the line of the mountains, and could be compared to the sketches he had made of Villa Adriana in near Rome, for instance, in 1911, and during further trips. So the High Court of Justice was the first of these buildings, and is extremely spectacular as a sort of large, shadowy place for the gathering of people and for the celebration floor. And here again, Kim was engaged, not in the building as such, but he was engaged in the detailing of a gigantic tapestry, 144 square meters, which was hung in the main hall, in the main court, for acoustic reasons. Here we see the general view of the tapestry, the general drawing. Here we see the original cartoon, the original drawing used by the Indian craftspeople who worked on the tapestry. And here we see two little drawings by Kim, which can be found again here and there on this cartoon, which I will exhibit very soon in a show on Le Corbusier's tapestries in New York. And here is the production of the tapestry by Indian craftspeople locally. So Kim's contribution was noticeable and very important in the development of the secretariat, the building of the ministers. Here we see it in the distance, and we see a drawing by Kim, which is one of his most interesting drawings among the 326 he made in Paris. We see here the building has completed with a series of shapes which will percolate in Kim's work later. Here, yes, together with Richard Pear, we went to see the ramps, which were also an aspect of a building developed by Kim, and who also took a cue from other buildings on the Capitol, for instance, the Assembly. Let's take the example of these superstructures of the Assembly, which find some echoes in Kim's work. The magnificent hypostyle hall underneath the meeting rooms of the Parliament are also another work which was extremely well known by Kim, and I found an echo of this building, the ramps and the columns in this clinic he built later in Seoul. Also a communication, a relationship between Chandigarh and Kim's work appears with Governor's Palace, for which he was one of the key draftspeople. So he worked on this unbuilt project for the Governor's Palace. Today, the Punjabi government has expressed its desire to build it finally. I'm not sure it's a great idea, but at least the project remains a very rich and significant one. We see here how in a hen house of the French embassy, the superstructures refer to the top of the Governor's Palace or to the top of the Assembly building. In a way, a sort of triangulation from Paris to Chandigarh and Korea. Kim also worked on the major houses designed by Le Corbusier in India, which continue the work engaged with the jowl houses, the Sarabhai house with its brick vaults, the unbuilt Chimambai house, which would have been a very interesting and complex building, the most complex of all the ones designed for Ahmedabad, but unbuilt. And here we see the Shodan house, which is a reflection, a sort of return to Le Corbusier's 5 points of a new architecture. In particular, we see here the free facade, and inside the free plan is deployed. This is a view of the interior, which is difficult to see today. Finally, Kim also worked on the Millowners Association building, which remains one of the most remarkable structures in Ahmedabad, with unfortunately a rather, I would say, demolished or destroyed landscape today with the modernization of the city. It's a very beautiful building because of the articulation between the grid of the building and of the sunbreakers and the autonomous plastic shapes. It's one of the buildings in which the synthesis of the arts I have mentioned before is really taking place, in which sculpture, at least sculpture, meets architecture, and in many features of the building, including this small meeting hall, which is usually overlooked and is for me one of the most poetic spaces of a building. So as a conclusion, if I make a conclusion, give a conclusion to this short story, I think that what could be learned, what has been learned probably, again, we have to be hypothetical, by Kim during the time he spent with Le Corbusier, was a sort of a sense of freedom in respect to architecture. The idea that the work of Le Corbusier was not a closed collection of examples to be repeated, to be transformed, but that the very lesson of his architecture in this period of his life was creative freedom, and also, as we've seen in Chandigarh or in Marseille, also a keen sense of observation, which will also observation of the cities and observation of various realms of culture, from high culture to a vernacular, which would again which fed Le Corbusier's work and will be one of the sources for Kim's production. Many thanks for your attention.